something that is so simple, so easy to implement, so practical, and it can have a profound impact on your ability to sell and sell significantly sized deals. It's just, storytelling is just so engaging. So in terms of agenda, if we go to the next slide, what I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time explaining the emotional impact of storytelling. And then once we have that, I want to share with you a very practical, very straightforward framework for crafting your stories, and then we'll have some Q&A. And as Carla says, we won't be recording those questions, so I'm happy to entertain any questions, no matter how specific they are. So if we go to the next slide, just, for your own sake, think about this. How often do you use PowerPoint, Keynote, or Prezi to demonstrate your value? And when I think of my sales career, I've been at this for quite a while. I won't say how long, so I don't date myself. But I've been at this for a while, and I remember when I started out, these presentations were crafted for us. And maybe that's your case as well, where somebody crafts your value proposition and says, this is how you present our value. And then you stand up and you give your presentation, and hopefully you wow people. But if we go to the next slide, generally speaking, that's not the case. What happens is we end up boring our audiences rather than engaging them. And there's just something about the way information is generally transmitted when we are using PowerPoint, Keynote, or Prezi in a very linear way. We're transmitting this information, and we're not engaging the hearts of the people who are listening. And we can easily change that simply by learning to tell better stories. And if you'll permit me, I'll just share with you a quick story in terms of how I got started in sales. And looking at this picture that you're looking at now reminds me of when I was 17 years old in high school in grade 12. I was sitting in math class, and the teacher was writing a formula on the board. And as I looked at this formula, I just thought to myself, I will never use this. This is completely useless. And I was already somewhat disgruntled with school. I was somewhat bored with school. And I decided right then and there I was done. And I walked out of that class. I went home and I basically announced that I was done with school. Of course, that didn't go over very well. And to make a long story short, I was thrown out of my home. And I became homeless at 17. And I won't dwell on the details, but, part of my time I was living in a stairwell. I was just basically down and out. And I did that for a couple of years. And I was driving taxi. Once I turned 18, I got my taxi license, and that's how I was making a living, or trying to make a living. And ends were not meeting. And at 19, I finally got frustrated, and I had enough. And I said, that's it. I realized the value of school. I'm going back to school. And I basically, within a couple of years, completely turned my life around. And I am so grateful for the sales profession, because that's really, when I was going to school, I didn't have enough money, and I started my own business, and I discovered selling. I was selling advertising, and I went around to the various retailers who were trying to reach the university market. And I just fell in love. I had this passionate love for selling, because I realized it was about helping people. Selling is really about serving. And to make a long story short, I've had a very, very lucrative career. And I've been able to surpass many of my colleagues from school who went on and they became professionals and they did everything right. But learning how to sell enabled me to completely recover, and surpass my colleagues. So I'm going to share with you just one secret in selling that is so powerful, and it's the secret around storytelling. And if we go to the next slide, I just absolutely love this quote. Philip Pullman is an award-winning novelist, and he says this, which is quite profound. After nourishment, shelter, and companionship. So nourishment, shelter, and companionship. After these things, stories are the thing we need most in the world. wow, when I came across this quote, it just stopped me in my tracks. And I just thought, is this true? And I believe that there is something psychically nourishing about stories. There's something extremely powerful about the stories that we tell to each other. And here's a man that makes his living telling stories. And he has discovered that there's something about storytelling which feeds the soul. And if you think about ancient cultures, maybe illiterate cultures, oral cultures, all of these cultures, what they have in common is they tell stories to each other. And the older generation tells stories to the younger generation. And in fact, in our modern society, we do the same thing. If any of you are parents and you have children, you tell your children stories. And when you tell your children stories, they pay attention because there's something in a story that we can't help it. It's an involuntary response. When somebody starts to tell us a story, we have this involuntary response where we have to listen. We have to find out what happens next. And if we go to the next slide, part of the magic of story, which is tied to the magic of selling, is this understanding of what change is. Because when we're listening to a story, what we are really listening for is change. And when somebody buys your product or buys your service, what they are really buying from you is change. So selling and storytelling have this fundamental concept in common, that change is what underlies it. And so what is change? Change is a transition from a current state to a future state. And what motivates someone to move from their current state to that future state is one of two things. They are either A, threatened by something that is in the current state, or B, they see an opportunity in the future state that doesn't exist in the current state, or a combination of both. And so when you are selling, fundamentally what you are selling is the transition state. What people are buying is the future state. But what you're providing is this transition state, this ability to get them from where they are to where they want to be. Now, this transition state is the problem because it is filled with risk. It's filled with uncertainty. It's filled with instability. And it's extremely stressful and uncomfortable. And that's what people are actually buying from you, this state of being in an unknown situation. But the reason they're going to go through that state with you is because they see something greater at the other end. And so the benefit of the future state so outweighs the transition state that it's worth it to them to go forward. And so in your storytelling, this is really an opportunity for you in telling stories to enable your buyer, your prospect, your customer, to try on the future state with no risk. They can live out the future state vicariously and try it on for size and see how much they like it. And in a sense, it opens up neural pathways in the brain so that they have virtually experienced your solution. And that builds motivation for them. Now, it's important, if we can go to the next slide, for us to be sensitive to the world of our buyers. And in our modern society, we are awash in change. And I don't know your personal life, I don't know your professional life, but I'm guessing that in both your personal and your professional life, you're facing multiple changes at once. And when human beings face too much change at once, they become overwhelmed and they shut down. And they generally prefer to do nothing, just kind of wait it out and hope it goes away. And so whatever change you're proposing, it's in the context of someone who is awash in change. And do they really want to take on yet another change? And do they want to take on this change at this time? And so part of what you have to do in being successful in selling is you have to make your change, the change that you're proposing, so compelling, so desirable that they prioritize it. And it moves up to the top right rather than down in the bottom left. And despite all of the other changes that they're going through, your change is so desirable that they prioritize it. And they want to go through that. And so what we're speaking about now is the power of emotion in the process of buying. That this is the problem really with a lot of the PowerPoint keynote presentations that are out there that are pre-scripted. The problem is they are designed to appeal to logic. They're designed to appeal to the mental faculties of the listener. And change does not come from logic. Logic does not empower change. Logic simply permits change. Logic will look at a situation and say, yes, this makes sense. But that's not enough juice to actually go forward with the change. The juice to go forward with the change comes from emotion. And if we can look at the next slide, Carla. This is what I call the buying cycle. And I'll just read this to you so you can see what's on it. Basically, what this slide is saying is buying is a cycle that is repeated over and over again. So basically, people are always in a state of buying. We just have to understand which state, which part of that state they're in. And so the buying process begins with step one. So we're starting with the status quo. And the very first step in buying is awareness. And as sellers, we misunderstand what this means. As sellers, we think that we have to make people aware of our brand. And so we invest in advertising to tell people about our brand. Well, the shocking news is nobody cares. Nobody cares about my brand. Nobody cares about your brand. But people do care about themselves. And so awareness is a state of awareness around where I am and where I could be and the gap. That I'm not where I could be. There's a gap. I'm here. Something is frustrating me. I'm not getting everything that I believe I should have. And I become aware of that. I didn't know that there was a better way, but somehow I have become aware that there is a better way. And now I'm aware of this gap. That's what initiates a buying process. And so the question I ask myself now is this a problem for me? Is there a gap? And if there is, should something be done about it? And the minute I answer yes to those two questions, I am in an active buying journey. I'm in an active process. And so the next step after awareness, once I'm aware that I have a problem, that there is a gap, there is a challenge that a gap that I need to close, the next step, number 2, is assessment. This is where I now begin to look at what are the different ways I can close this gap. And I apply criteria to see which is the best of these different options that I have. And you'll notice there's an inside circle beside awareness, it says emotion, and beside assessment, it says logic. The emotion that we're looking for in the awareness phase, there are 2 emotions we're looking for. Remember that change is about moving from the current state to the future state. There's a threat in the current state or there's an opportunity in the future state. And so the emotions that correspond with those 2 realities, number 1 is frustration or fear. That I have a frustration with the status quo or a fear of a threat that's in the status quo. That's one emotion that we're looking for, two sides of the same emotion that we're looking for. The other is desire, that I see something in the future state and I want that, and it triggers desire. So we've got fear and frustration on one hand and desire on the other. Once I accept that there is a gap and I'm aware of that gap, there's another part of my mind that then kicks in, and this is the logical side. Now I want to know, okay, what are my options? And I begin to apply a kind of a logical analysis to see what's the best route here. So that there's many paths I can take. Which one is the best one, and how do I judge? And so this is a logical exercise that we call assessment. And sometimes I'll involve other people in this. What I'm looking for in the logical stage of assessment is the best option. And so I'm really looking for the best solution and the best qualities of the best solution. Once I've decided on a solution, emotion kicks in again. And the emotion that kicks in now is apprehension. And once I've chosen, let's say I've chosen your solution as the best option, in selecting you as the best option, I was really focused on all of your virtues, all the things you do well. Once I've selected you, however, this apprehension kicks in, this anxiety kicks in, and I become consumed with your flaws, all the things that could go wrong. And so I've shifted my focus now to what's wrong with your solution. And so on the one hand, in the assessment phase, I may have selected you because you're a smaller company, and I like the personal attention that we'll get from your company, that we will be a significant customer for you. But once I've selected you, I begin to worry about the fact that you're small and you're not as big as the other companies. And so you need to be very careful. Most sales are lost in the apprehension phase. And it's not that they're lost completely, but the buyer runs out of steam here. They delay and they delay and they delay, and the emotional excitement that they felt in the awareness phase just dissipates. And they no longer have that energy to go forward. If, however, they come to terms with the risk of your solution and they figure out how they can mitigate the risk or address the risk, they're ready to take action. And that's the stage that traditionally we would call the close. This is where they'll issue a purchase order, they'll sign a contract, they'll enter into negotiation in order to get started. And the action stage really is anticlimactic, that if you do everything well, it just happens naturally. And there's no big bells and whistles around what we traditionally call the close. Because the opening, what you do in the awareness phase, is the most important. And this, in fact, is where the deal, psychologically, is made. That they actually purchase your product or your service in the awareness stage vicariously, rather than waiting until they're in the action stage. When they're in the action stage, they're just physically following through on something they've already mentally done. The final stage is adoption. And this is where, after they have bought from you, they now have to integrate your solution into their daily life. It needs to become a part of their new reality. You now need to become part of the new status quo. And in this phase, it's emotional as well. And the emotions here are either fulfillment. I bought your service or your product on a promise, and I believe that this was going to be a better future for me. And now I see that, in fact, I'm getting what I had hoped, or even hopefully more, and I feel fulfilled. Or the worst that could happen is I feel resentment, that I bought this product or service from you based on your promise, and I was very hopeful, and now I see I'm not getting what I had hoped to get. And so I become resentful. And this is the worst thing, especially in an age of social media, that customers now have a voice, and they're not shy about sharing their experiences. And so this is what we call the sale after the sale. After you've made the sale, you need to keep selling. And you need to make sure that people see that they are, in fact, getting more than they bargained for, that you're exceeding their expectations. So this is the buying cycle. And the most important phase in this cycle is step one. It's awareness. And how you present yourself to the market really matters. And just what I would say is, look at your advertising, look at your marketing. And if you are promoting your brand, you're making a mistake. What you should be promoting is the gap that people in your target market are facing, so that when somebody hears that gap, they say, you know what, that's my situation. That's how I feel. I need to make more sales. My business is not thriving the way it should. I'm frustrated with where my business is. It sounds like these guys know what they're talking about. And so really what you're marketing in step one is the gap, not your brand. Your brand will come in step two when they're assessing how to address the gap. But if we go to the next slide, what fuels the buying cycle? I mentioned it earlier. It's not logic. Logic actually prevents us from taking action. Emotion drives us forward. And I'll go so far as to say all of the progress in the world is driven by emotion. You know, when John F. Kennedy said, we will send a man to the moon before the end of this decade and return him safely to Earth, that was an emotional statement, and it was driven by emotion, and he captured the attention of the whole United States, and maybe the whole world. They captured it emotionally, and they did it. They did it because it sounded impossible, but they were driven by emotion. And that's what we need to look at when we are engaging our customers. How can we engage them emotionally? And we don't do this with logic. We don't do this with logical presentation. People use logic to find reasons why they shouldn't do things more than they use logic to actually do things. So if we go to the next slide, I've developed this what I call tree of emotions. And what this graphic is showing you is that we have two categories of emotions. We have positive emotions and we have negative emotions. But that all of our emotions are tied to goals. All of our emotions are tied to goals. And it's because we have goals that we have an emotional system. And what the emotions are telling us is if we feel positive emotions, it's because we're getting closer to our goals. That the way we're wired, as we move toward our goals, we feel positive sensations. Alternatively, anything that frustrates us from achieving our goals causes us to feel negative emotions. And the fundamental emotions are fear and desire, because we're either moving towards something or we're trying to move away from something. And so fear is the foundation of all of our negative emotions, and desire is the foundation of all of our positive emotions. And so we need to learn how to engage these emotions of our buyers. And both work. And ideally, we're engaging both. A lot of people sell on fear, look for the pain. It's not enough. We've also got to understand the desire. What is the gain? What are people trying to achieve? And we need to engage them on both sides. If we go to the next slide. I think we've all seen this where, people have three levels of brain activity. There's the intellectual, there's the emotional, and then there's the reptilian, or what's based on survival. And basically all this is saying, in a nutshell, the emotional and the reptilian brains are subconscious, and they are very powerful. The intellectual brain is our conscious brain. It's extremely sophisticated, but it's very weak. And so once the subconscious mind locks onto something that it wants, it basically recruits the intellect, our intellect, to justify what we want. And so if we're selling to intellect, we're making a mistake. We've got to appeal to the emotional and the reptilian brain, and we've got to engage the brain at that level. And this is done through storytelling. When we tell stories, it basically bypasses the intellect and goes straight to the subconscious. And the subconscious then processes the story. And if it engages, then it knows what it wants. And it recruits the intellect to justify what it wants. And if we go to the next slide, I'd really ask you to remember this formula. It basically says action is a function of belief. And what we're doing when we're selling people is we are asking them to take a new course of action. You have never bought anything from me. I'm asking you to change that and to now start buying from me. Well, that's a change in action. If you're going to change your actions, it means that your belief system must also change. In fact, it must change first, because everything we do is consistent with our belief system. And so really how should I say this? The business that we are in as sales professionals is the business of changing people's beliefs. And the more effective we are at changing beliefs, the more effective we are at getting people to change their actions. We can't twist people's arms. We can't force people to comply. What we can do is figure out what they believe now and get them to change their beliefs to go forward. And if we look at the next slide, and just fill this out, there's just a couple of bullet points on this. It'll say ASL, so we'll just forward this out. So amenity, strategic context, attention, focusing, linkage, and envisioning. Okay, so this slide is showing you basically there's two ways that we can change people's beliefs. One is the questions that we ask, and two, the stories that we tell. And this is a framework. In fact, if you send me an email afterward, adrian@adriandavis.com, I will give you a library of questions that follow this framework. And this is a framework that's designed to uncover both the desire and the fear of your prospect so that you can craft your story to address both sides. Amenity is basically questions we ask to make people comfortable to build rapport. Strategic context gets at what is their desire, their long-term desire. What are they really trying to accomplish in their lives and in their business? Attention focusing focuses on the status quo. What's wrong in the status quo? Linkage combines the two. Let's combine what's wrong in the status quo with what you ultimately want to achieve. And in that way, we combine the emotion of fear with the emotion of desire, and we get them working together. And then finally, envisioning helps them to envision what future they would like to have, how they would like, if the status quo were to be corrected, what would it look like? And so, as I say, I won't spend more time on this, but if you would like a set of questions, I have a library of 100 questions that are categorized that enable you to have this dialogue and in so doing uncover the emotional drivers of your prospects. But what I want to focus on is the other side, the storytelling. So if we look at the next slide, and you can just sort of think about this, how often do you use stories in your presentation? And the correct answer is always. We want to, it's so natural. It's what we do as human beings. If you're in Canada, we've just had a long weekend, Victoria Day weekend. We're with friends, we're with family. We tell each other stories. It's what human beings do. And as salespeople, we're still human beings connecting with other human beings. And we just have to make storytelling a natural part of what we do. And if we go to the next slide, I had mentioned this earlier, that, we tell children stories. And if you look at this slide here, I think it's coming up, yeah. Here's a classroom of kids that normally would be very difficult to have them sit still. And yet they have no problem sitting still listening to this storytelling, because there's something about story which is captivating. And what I believe it is this. We all have a database of stories that help us navigate the world. We basically interpret what's happening around us based on the stories that we have in our database. And this is why parents tell children stories. When we tell our children the story of Little Red Riding Hood, which everybody knows, it's not that we just want to entertain them about the adventures of Little Red Riding Hood. There's a lesson in the story. And we want to warn them about the dangers of engaging strangers. And so, we love the story, we're engaged in the story, but we take the lesson. And as we're navigating the world, we remember strangers can be dangerous. And in the same way, in business, it's the same thing. There's a part of us that is hungry for story. And we want to understand, how have other people been successful? We also want to understand, how have other people been unsuccessful? And we store these things, and we have an insatiable appetite for story. because we never know what we're going to face tomorrow. And whatever we face, our ability to face it successfully is a function of how many stories we have access to that will help us navigate that situation. And since we can't anticipate what we will face tomorrow, we collect stories. And we don't know what our friends will face, and our friends may turn to us and ask us for advice. And we may not have that experience, but we can say, I heard about something like this happening to somebody else, and we can give them advice. So we never run out of our appetite for more story. And this is something that you can see here starts as early as childhood, where children just want to hear the story over and over again. And even as adults, we're still stuck on story because it's involuntary. It's processed at a subconscious level, not at a conscious level. So if we go to the next slide. And this is really the question, and I've asked this question to many, many sales professionals. And generally speaking, the answer I get is no. That, some are just naturally better at it than others, but they really don't have an underlying structure that they're working with. They're just telling stories, and some people are not even telling stories. But the ones that do, when I ask them, well, what's the framework that you're using, they really don't have one. And so I want to share with you a very simple, a very powerful framework that as soon as you hear it, you'll never forget it, and you'll be able to use it immediately. You'll be able to use it this afternoon if you're meeting with somebody. If we look at the next slide, and this again is another award-winning author, and this is again a very, very powerful quote. Listen to this. He says, "It's like everyone tells a story about themselves inside their own head. Always, all the time. That story makes you what you are. We build ourselves out of that story." This is so profound. This is saying story is always on. And each of us is a story that is manifesting itself over time, because we have all bought a story for ourselves. And this, again, we said earlier that action is a function of belief. And so the actions that you are taking in your life are a function of the story that you're telling yourself about yourself. And another reason then that story is so compelling is because it allows us to try on a new version of a story for ourselves. And as we hear stories of other people, it allows us to potentially rewrite the story that we are telling ourselves about ourselves. And so as you go out into the marketplace and you start sharing your stories of the successes that you've had with your customers, what you're allowing your prospects to do is the opportunity to rewrite their story. That they can now have a level of success that perhaps they didn't imagine before, or perhaps they didn't think was possible. But when they hear what you've done with your clients, they're like, wow, that sounds like it could be possible for me. And they begin to rewrite their own story, and action is a function of belief. So as they rewrite their own story, they're willing to try out new actions. And so if we have the next slide, as you think about telling your story, remember what we said earlier, that buying is about change. I'm in one state, I want to be in another state. And that's also what storytelling is about. Storytelling is not about just recounting what's happening right now. That would be totally boring. If we went to a movie, I don't know what paid $15, $16 to go and see a movie, and all it did was tell us about somebody's current situation, and they did that for an hour or 2 hours, and then it stopped, we would be furious. We would demand our money back, because there's no story unless there's a transition state. That somebody has to go from a current state into a future state in order for us to have a story. And the real story is the transition state, what they went through. And if we look at the next slide, this process of going from a current state to a future state, as far as storytelling goes, we see it as beginning, middle, and end. In the beginning, there's a setup, and then the real story is in the middle. The meat is in the middle, where there's conflict. Something happens and there's a conflict, and then the conflict is resolved, and there's a transformation of some sort. This is really what storytelling is all about. So rather than, a lot of people do case studies. What I would say is case studies are okay, but they're impersonal. And the real magic of storytelling is when you make it personal. When you're telling one human being a story about another human being. This is what gets people's attention. And so if you just think beginning, middle, end, there's a setup, there's a conflict, and there's a resolution. Now, the framework that we want to use in our storytelling, we call it the hero's journey. And so if we look at the next slide, and this is really the framework. Just think in terms of 5 steps as you tell your story. Number 1, you're going to introduce the hero. And I need to say this twice because the first time it probably won't sink in. You are never the hero. When you tell the story of the hero's journey, I'll say it again, you, your company, your product, your service are never the hero. If you make yourself the hero, you alienate your buyer. They already feel somewhat suspicious of sellers. And if you promote yourself, they immediately disengage with you and try to poke holes in what you're saying. The way to tell your story effectively is to ensure that you're telling the story about a buyer that is similar to your prospect. And similar along 2 dimensions. Dimension 1, and I hope you're making some notes, because this is really, really important. Dimension 1, similar in role. Similar in role. So if you are selling to a VP of manufacturing, and you tell a story about, a salesperson, let's say, then the VP of manufacturing is going to have a difficult time engaging in your story because the roles are so different. So if I'm selling to a VP of manufacturing, I'm going to tell a story to that person about another VP of manufacturing. Once I do that, I'm going to get his or her attention. Because remember, we have this database of stories that we're collecting. And if somebody's in a similar role to me, I never know when I may face that situation in the future. So you have my undivided attention. Secondly, and I would even say more importantly, the hero must be similar to your prospect in their goal. So similar in role and similar in goal. And remember we said, so similar in role gives me relevance. This story is going to be relevant to me because I'm a business owner and you're going to tell us a story about another business owner, same size, similar business. So the role is similar, you got my attention. It's relevant. Similar in goal is where you get the emotional engagement. Remember we said that all of our emotions are tied to goals. And so if I present to you that this salesperson had a similar goal to you, and you're in sales as well, you're going to pay attention, not just because of the relevance, but the emotions will kick in, and it's involuntary. You're trying to achieve this. This person achieved it. You're involuntarily committed to the story. It's the metaphor I like to use is it's like getting in a car, and you put it in drive, and the doors lock automatically. The moment you present your hero as similar in role and goal, I cannot help, I have no choice in the matter. I climb into the skin of the hero, and the doors lock. I'm in for the journey now. Whatever happens to that hero, I'm going along for the ride. And so once I've presented my hero, and I want to make this person likable, I want to show how they're similar to you in their role and their goal, the next thing I do is I introduce the villain. And in fact, if you watch movies, they follow this exact formula. They make sure that you like the hero first before they present the villain. You have to be invested in the hero before we present the villain. And I remember I was flying out west, and I was on this plane, and I was reading, I was doing my work, I wasn't watching any movies, and I happened to look up across the seat diagonally across the aisle from me, and I saw a chase scene happening. Some terrible person was chasing this young lady who looked very innocent and nice and everything, and it looked like an emotionally gripping scene. And I realized that I couldn't care less. I was not engaged. I didn't see the lead up. I didn't see the setup. And so this lady's being chased by this bad guy, and it had no emotional impact on me because I missed the whole setup. I wasn't invested in the hero. And so when you introduce the hero, it's important that that emotional investment is there before you introduce the villain. The hero must be a person. It must be a person that's similar in role and goal. The villain does not have to be a person. The villain can be a person, a place, or a thing. It could be, a terrible boss, a terrible customer. It could be the economic situation. It could be a change in circumstances. It doesn't have to be a person, but it's something that introduces stress to the hero. And as a result of the villain entering the hero's life, things go poorly for the hero. They begin to lose things. Their life is unraveling, and they're going down. Now, step 3 is where you come in. As the hero is going down, they come across a new resource. And that new resource gives them renewed strength. And they're able now to fight back in a way that they weren't before. They have new knowledge, they have new capabilities, they have new tools, and this is what you're selling. And because they have acquired these new abilities from you, they can now struggle and become triumphant. So step 4 now is the triumph. And as a result of the triumph, this is really now the resolution of the story. Step 5 is transformation, that they have changed in some fundamental way. So just to give you a quick example, and you don't have to be an award-winning novelist to do this. We're just human beings telling stories to one another. And so here, if I'm speaking to salespeople, I'm going to assume that all of you are in sales in some way. I'll just tell you a quick story about one of my clients. His name is Jeff. He lives out in Saskatoon, and he works for a company that has an extremely healthy culture. I'm quite impressed with this company's culture. They've done a lot to really hire people carefully. They hire based on character rather than skill. Character first. And Jeff, they call him the Barney Rubble of the company. So if you know anything about the Flintstones, Barney Rubble is this kind of folksy guy, and if you met Jeff, you would actually see why they call him this. But why they hired Jeff was his work ethic. He really didn't have experience selling the technology that they sold or that they sell, but he had a very strong work ethic, and he desired to be successful in sales, and he was doing okay. The problem is the company wanted to up their game. They realized they had been playing a kind of safe game for a long time, and their sales had plateaued, and they decided they wanted to play big. And this is when they really made a push to get in front of senior executives, and they began to fail. And Jeff began to fail. He never finished high school, so he didn't have an education, but as I said, he had a strong work ethic. As a result of this, his future was in the balance, whether or not, and they didn't want to let him go because he was the right character, but he wasn't performing. They brought me in to work with the team and to help them understand how to sell to C-level executives. And I started walking through this training program with me, and Jeff actually called me aside, and he was worried. And he said to me, "Adrian, I don't think I can do this." And I asked him, "Why not?" And he said, "I don't have the vocabulary to talk to senior executives. I don't have an education." And he was really torn up about this. He didn't want to let his company down. He didn't want to let himself down. And so I listened to him for a little bit, and then I explained to him that the process that we're implementing doesn't require vocabulary, because it's not about impressing people with how intelligent he is. It's about understanding what people are trying to accomplish, and C-level executives are just people. And once we understand what they're trying to accomplish, figuring out how we can be helpful to them, how we can enable them to achieve their goals. And so we worked with Jeff, and the manager was very good. His manager's name was Brett. Got very engaged with Jeff, and we just coached him and worked with him. It took about 18 months. I went back out to meet him in person again. This guy is flying. He's bought a boat. He's bought a cottage. He is confident. He has swagger. In fact, he's now a sales manager. He has 3 people reporting to him. And that's another challenge that he's going through now. But he has really succeeded. He's really turned the corner. And it's not so much the material wealth that he has, although he's enjoying that. The real transformation is his self-confidence. Here's a guy that didn't finish high school, and he is now a leading player in the industry, meeting with C-level executives of some of the largest companies in Canada. And he does it. He does it every day. In fact, he's responsible now for the whole healthcare industry out west. So this is just a simple example of the hero's journey. I'm not talking about how great I am. I'm talking about how great Jeff is and the character he has, a very likable person, and how he just really wanted to succeed, but found himself in a situation where he was failing and his job was on the line. But he just figured out, we just showed him a few things, how to really engage senior level executives in an effective and natural way, and he made it work. So there's an example of the hero's journey. So if we go to the next slide. And as you put your story together, you want to think about your objective. What is the action that you want your buyer to take? And once you understand that action, then what's the belief that has to change in order for them to take that action? And you want to craft your story to influence belief. And again, once you start telling a story, people have no choice. They will listen, and they'll digest it. It's something that, once we're engaged in a story, that critical function in our mind slows down. In some cases, it shuts down completely, and we just accept the story. And once the story is digested, then the critical functions come back online. But it's too late. We've already digested the story. And so this is a very, very powerful way of having the opportunity to shift people's beliefs. So think about, how will you get people's attention? How will you engage them? Be very clear on who the hero is. Remember, it's not you. Be clear about who or what the villain is. In some cases, things could be going terribly wrong at work, but the villain is actually at home, in the sense that maybe somebody's spouse is getting really upset with them because they never have dinner with the family. They're never home. Even when they are home, they're distracted with their work. And so that could be the villain. So think about, what is the villain? And you may have to, don't be shy about calling up your customers and asking them, share with me how I've helped you. And how has that helped you on a personal level? And how has it helped you on a professional level? And they will share with you how you've helped them. And that's all good information to put into your stories. And what is the goal? What is it that they were trying to accomplish that you were able to help them? And then think about how you'll have the story unfold, and most importantly, how the hero overcomes the obstacle, what changes as a result. So the triumph is one thing, the transformation is another, right? So Jeff went from not really knowing anything about the industry, good work ethic, things were going okay, and then the company changed on him. And suddenly he's like a fish out of water, and he's panicking, and he's got a family, and he's on the verge of losing his job, to going from there to now being so successful. He has a team under him, so successful his personal wealth has increased dramatically because he really now understands how to close big deals. And he understands that it's not about him. It's about who he is serving. So think about the triumph and the transformation. And then in terms of the moral of the story, This is something you can do. It's a very powerful twist that you can put on your stories. Once you've told your story, if you really want to put a fine point on the belief that you want your listener to have, or the belief that you want to shift in them, you can do it explicitly, but not manipulatively, by simply saying, and you know, what I learned from this experience is, and then you say what you've learned from the experience. Or I could say, and you know, when I was speaking to Jeff, he told me what he learned from this experience is. You know, we might say something like, when you have the right partner, you can do anything. That all you need is a great dream and the right partners, and anything is possible. That's what he learned, or that's what I learned. I'm not saying to you, this is what you must believe. I'm just saying, hey, this is what I learned, or this is what my client learned. And what you're doing is articulating a belief that, hey, that's reasonable. And it's a way for people to connect with the belief that you would like them to have without jamming it down their throat. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, and we'll just wrap up. So I have a template that I put together that allows you to think through your stories, go through your different clients, and basically brainstorm and then structure your story. So if you would like that template, just email me, adrian@adriandavis.com, and just write storytelling template in the subject line. I also promised you a question library, 100 questions that are sorted into 5 categories to enable you to have better dialogue with your prospects. And just if you want that, just put question library in the subject line as well. So those 2 resources are available to you at no charge. Just want you to get better at telling stories and make the sales process more enjoyable and more meaningful for your buyers. And so just adrian@adriandavis.com, storytelling template, and or question library, and I'll have those sent out to you. We'll go to the last slide, which is questions. And I'm happy to entertain your questions and provide you any other knowledge or information that I have. I'm happy to share that with you.